Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and if you've listened to some of the episodes on this podcast, how to turn toxic conflict into healthy conflict or how to avoid conflict altogether, you've undoubtedly heard people speak about the virtues of curiosity. We've got to be more curious and less judgmental, so many people have said. Conflict experts like Amanda Ripley and monica-guzman, Peter Coleman all talk about it. But what is curiosity, and how can we be curious and not judgmental when we're interacting with people whose views are really different from our own, or whose views we find abhorrent? What prevents us from being curious? How do and can schools promote curiosity? And do they sometimes produce students who are incurious? Well, today, my guest, Scott Shigeoka, is someone who has devoted years thinking, writing, talking about curiosity. He's done TED Talks about it. He's spoken at Google, Microsoft, Pixar, Meta, Airbnb, as well as university and schools all over the world. He's also written a highly acclaimed book about curiosity called Seek: How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. Well, it seemed fitting that Scott would be a guest on this podcast. One thing I can't wait to ask Scott about is what he's curious about when it comes to the role schools and educators play when it comes to cultivating curiosity, or whether they sometimes promote the opposite, the word I used a little earlier, incuriosity. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks. I'm so excited to be on this show, Ken. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. It's great to see you. And I thought a lot about you as I was reading your book recently. I was really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm curious. I'm just what prompted you to devote so much of your life to this concept, this superpower, as you call it?
Yeah, well, curiosity has been so important for me in my personal life. I grew up in Hawaii, and my parents really instilled that into me. They were always, encouraging me to ask questions, encouraging me to have new experiences. They modeled curiosity. We would go on the bus, to the beach, and they would talk to the people around them and ask some questions. We would always hold up the supermarket line. We'd be one of those families because they're like chatting it up with, the folks and as they're, getting checked out. And I really loved like seeing that and feeling that from, my parents, from my family, where the power of, being a good neighbor and being open and, asking people questions and really genuinely being interested in how people are truly doing, and so I think from a young age, curiosity was really instilled in me. And just throughout my younger sort of adult and professional years, I've been doing some research on curiosity at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, which is a center that's focused on how do we live a purposeful life. And I've just been seeing how important it is for us to find fulfillment and for us to have happiness, not just in ourselves, but in our relationships as well. And so just given what's going on today in the world, and what's going on in people's lives, I just think there's, for me, nothing more worthwhile to promote in the world than curiosity.
I just two things came up in my mind as you were talking. One is you have a chapter in your book Seek that talks about how curiosity is contagious, and so talking about your parents growing up in a household and with parents who were curious themselves and encouraged you to be that way, made a difference in your life. That's the first thing that came to your mind. I'm guessing that if you grow up in an environment, in a classroom or in schools, and your parents and relatives are not curious, you could learn to be incurious without someone pointing out that there's another way to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Curiosity. So let's define it first, is the desire to know and understand. And sometimes, we are, we are not sometimes, we are all naturally curious. We are born with it. It's something that we have thanks to our ancestors, who needed that curiosity to survive. They looked for food and for water. And it's a building block for communication for those of us who are verbal. So, you see, folks getting curious about their vocal anatomy, when they're younger and, they're babbling. They're like, wow, ah, ooh, that's them getting curious about, what is possible with our communication. And when we see a reaction, from the adults or the other humans in our lives, that encourages us to continue learning. And that's something that's really, important for our survivability. But I think curiosity is also something that's not just intellectual. I think that's what we typically focus curiosity on. It's like, oh, how do I learn something new? How do I, read a new book or listen to a podcast, which I think are all great and ways to learn. But really, a lot of my work focuses on heart-centered curiosity. So bringing that curiosity from the mind into the heart. And I think that especially is something that we can learn from other people. When we feel seen and heard by people asking us questions, it incites something inside of us to want to ask them questions back, to want to get to know them. So in that way, yeah, it's pretty easy to see how curiosity is contagious. We can all look to our personal lives, and we know that when we're surrounded by people, our friends, our partners, our families, our neighbors who are curious about us, we naturally are, inclined to be curious back towards them. And so it creates this, what some researchers call the give and take spiral, this back and forth question asking and just like, oh my gosh, how did 4 hours pass? This is such an incredible conversation. Yeah, that's, I think, the beauty of curiosity.
In your book, I was reading it and thinking, this is all about how I can increase the pleasure in my life. I can learn more. I can be more productive. I can be a more interesting person. And for a while, I was thinking, this is all about me. And then, and curiosity seems like it could be something beyond that. And that's when I encountered something that, and I'm not saying exactly what you said, but this is the gist of what I read, is it's actually a gift to other people. And you alluded to it a little bit ago about strengthening relationships. It's actually being curious and genuinely, not performatively, inquiring about someone else's life, even someone that you don't agree with, is a way to strengthen the relationship. It's not just about me, it's about us.
Absolutely, because and I thought you paraphrased that like great. I think, yeah, yeah, I think it is a gift that we're giving to other people because when we turn to someone and we're genuinely curious about them and we ask them questions, what we're really communicating to them is, I want to know who you are. I want to know your story. I want to know, your nuances, I want to know what brings you joy. I want to know about the people in your life. I want to know about how you're hurting and how you're healing through that. All of those curiosities that we have about other people is really us communicating, I care about you and I want to know you and I see you and I love you. And I think that is really, the promise and the gift, like, I wrote in the book of curiosity that, it's a way of us expressing love. And I had always heard that adage of like, what is, like love is a verb, but like, okay, what does that mean then? Like, how do you
Yeah.
actually do it? And I'm, realizing now through this work that the verb is curiosity. That is a muscle that we can exercise and practice to demonstrate our love, not just to other people, but even to ourselves.
Yeah. And people who have listened to this podcast have heard me say this, share this little story, but it's really appropriate here again. And it's a story about Daryl Davis, who's a musician in South Carolina. Uh, he's a black musician, and he had a fan who was white, and they get to know each other. And the guy said, "I've actually never spoken to a black person." And Daryl asked him why. He says, "Well, I'm a member of the Klan." And Daryl, rather than leaving and getting upset and being offended, he became curious and said, "I want to know your story." And he didn't rebuff him, and they developed a relationship, a friendship, and eventually this guy turns his ropes over to Daryl Davis. So when you show some empathy and you show curiosity, even with someone whose actions and views you find abhorrent, and what could be more abhorrent than the values and actions of Klanspeople, at least when they're doing their Klan activities. And many people, other people that Daryl met, did the same thing. So it isn't just the people that we that are in our silo, in our echo chambers, it's people that are different from us.
I think that I'm queer, and I think some folks in the LGBTQ community, you know, can, relate to the story of, when I came out, almost everyone was, completely accepting and loving about it. But, there were a few, loved ones that, meant a lot to me in my life, and were not, accepting and celebratory. In fact, were, said it was a sin, and said, were concerned for me or did not like that part of me. And it created a fracture in the relationship, obviously, because this is who I am. And that part of me is not being seen or accepted or loved. And, I'm happy to say that it did take a few decades, but, I'm happy to say that these loved ones, by staying in relationship with them, and not, canceling them out of my life, eventually, by just me coming back to the islands and like bringing my partner and me having conversations with them, and encouraging this space of curiosity, there was a really beautiful experience that happened 2 Decembers ago, where they prayed for us, and not in the way that I had always thought that I was being prayed for growing up, in terms of praying my gay way, but praying for us in terms of us being happy, and praying for my partner and I to like live a beautiful life, and praying for our happiness. And it was the first time that part of me was really acknowledged, and was really supported by loved ones who years ago had told me that this was one of the worst parts about a person. And so I always, people have the capacity to change, I think is something that's so important. And if we just are cutting off our relationships and canceling them too early, because they, we disagree with them, or maybe there's a part of us that they don't understand, if we can stay open to an opportunity to share our own stories and to share our perspectives, there is a possibility that they can change. I will say, though, that sometimes that is not the story. So that is not the happy ending that everyone gets. It can be really dangerous, to, have a spirit of curiosity in a place where someone, hates you, or part, or one of your group identities, or, any part of you. And so I think having boundaries is really, really important. And so curiosity is still important in that case too, because we have to understand, what are our boundaries, and when do I actually feel safe or unsafe, and when is that imagined, and when is that real? And I think that's all a part of curiosity as well. So sorry, there's a long story, but like what you shared about Daryl's story just really, just brought something more personal up for me that I think was, important for me to share too. So.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been learning, and I heard it again from Tim Shriver, who I interviewed recently, who developed a dignity index, and the whole point of that is to get people in schools, teachers and kids and politicians, to sort of embrace the idea that we want to regard other people, even people that disagree with us, with a sense of dignity and not contempt. And I recall reading in a book, a wonderful book called Love Your Enemies, that the more we have contempt for them, the more of them there will be. That it was sort of to your point earlier, when we cancel people, sometimes, maybe we have to be safe, but when we cancel people, or we have contempt for people whose views we don't like, it actually can cause the problem that we're experiencing to become worse. And it so seems counterintuitive to do what Daryl Davis did, or what you did, is to open up to these people that were wanting to cancel you. Eventually ended in something pretty cool, pretty beautiful, and it restored the relationship, and probably caused them to rethink their positions a bit.
Yeah, and there's research to show that curiosity, does interrupt biases. It helps us to challenge our assumptions, and to challenge the stereotypes that we hold about other people. And so, I think as a practice, we need to continue to have an open mind and an open heart, especially in a world that's fracturing and is dividing across different lines, not just political, but social divides as well. identities like race and religion and age, even. I'm thinking about cultural phenomena like okay boomer, or the ways in which we're othering or holding other people in contempt, a whole group of people, and what curiosity can do to help us see the individuality of people, to help us interrupt some of those biases. I do think though that like we think that we're curious sometimes, but we're actually not, right? Like these are some pretty overt ways we're talking about being incurious, and most people would be like, "Yeah, but I see the humanity, the dignity of people. I'm totally curious." But there are these small ways, these more subtle ways that we're being incurious. For instance, when a student comes into class and is really upset about the grade that they got on their project, or maybe if you're a parent, your kid comes back and says like, "Oh my gosh, I did so bad on that soccer game," and I think something that we can do as an adult in that situation is we want to encourage them and support them and say, "No, you did great. Like it's just a C, or like you still won the game. Like you did some great passes." But even in that moment, we are actually being incurious because we're contradicting the worldview of this young person who just came up to us and said, "Hey, I feel like I did a bad job." And what we're replying to them is saying, "No, you didn't. You did great." What it does is it deteriorates their self-confidence about, them understanding their reality accurately or not. But it also closes the door on curiosity. It says, listen to me. It's a more sort of arrogant perspective, even though our intent is wanting to help them. So I always, encourage folks, and like I say in the book, is you can say, "I don't think you did a bad job on that project or on that soccer game, but tell me more. Like tell me more about why you think that you did not do great, because I want to know that perspective from you." And then it gives that child an opportunity to author their own narrative about their experience and how they think they did. And it gives you more insight. And maybe you do uncover, "Oh my gosh, like this, they do have like a self-critical voice. Like I knew it, that was my assumption and I knew that's accurate." Well, at least now they are telling that story for themselves. And at least now you are connecting about it versus just assuming that in the undercurrent and trying to proactively fix or solve their problem, for them. So I think there are ways we are incurious, just even in day-to-day conversations and day-to-day life, that might not look so overt as, holding, prejudiced views. But even those, we have many biases that, we hold, in ourselves that we also might not be aware of too. So I think they're both important to explore.
That really fascinating concept you just shared is that, many of us, I consider myself to be a curious person, but I think what you're suggesting is that all of us can sort of think about the the spaces that we inhabit and the people we interact with, the things we do, and really ask ourselves, am I truly curious in all of those places? And if not, what's going on? Which brings me to this question that I would love you to talk about a little bit is what is it that makes us incurious? I think we alluded to one thing before. It can be kind of contagious if you grow up in a household and your parents, people around you are incurious. And when you show curiosity, they don't really support us. Like, just do your work, just follow the directions, just do as you're told. I'm thinking about something that is stuck in my mind for years because through my own schooling and graduate school, I studied the work of John Dewey, who's a great educator, and back in the 1920s wrote a book called Democracy in Education, and in that book and again, this is like 100 years ago. He said, no one has ever explained why children are so full of questions outside of the school so that they pester grown-up persons if they get any encouragement, and the conspicuous absence of display of curiosity about the subject matter of school lessons. And he goes on to say is that we need to, no matter what a teacher does in terms of encouraging curiosity, there needs to be more stuff, more opportunities to do things. But talk a little bit, Scott, about what kinds of things in school might make students, cause students to become incurious, like John Dewey was noticing, and maybe even your own experiences in school where you had teachers that sort of shut down your, as you say, your sort of natural proclivity to want to be curious.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, obviously the modeling is really important. So whether folks around us are curious or not will really, impact whether we show up as young people as curious. But it's also, fear, a culture of fear can definitely stifle curiosity. If you are afraid of giving the wrong answer and you might be reprimanded for that, or if you're afraid of the rejection that that might cause, or how you might look for being curious and not staying in line. I think even the fear of a new experience or a new encounter and that can all prevent someone from being curious. But paradoxically, the way to feel more liberated from your fear, to feel more courageous, and what the research tells us about how to live a more fulfilling life and how to learn at a better rate and grow at a better rate, and not have a fixed mindset and have a growth mindset, it all depends on a lot of it depends on our curiosity, our ability to ask questions, our ability to make mistakes and experiment and try new things and have new experiences and new encounters. And so but there is a fear that sometimes holds us back, that we have to, have courage to be curious. And I think, I always share in schools, it's not enough to just share a culture of curiosity. We also have to share a culture of courage because, students need to feel that it's okay to try. And I think the other piece is trauma. I mean, there's a lot of trauma that's happening in this world that young people face. That, when I talked to trauma-informed therapists, they said, you know, it's really hard for someone who is going through trauma to be curious. It closes you off. It closes if you can almost imagine yourself like huddling into a ball, it doesn't allow you to, be open and to look out at the world because you're still healing or you're still trying to protect yourself really from, what has happened to you. And I definitely relate to that. I think, the moments when I look back where I had not healed or had been going through some deep trauma in my childhood. I wasn't curious and thinking about the world and adventuring. I was more focused on why I didn't feel like I belonged and, my confusion around my dad going in prison and what that meant for our family and, all of the things that happened to me that really impacted my curiosity. And again, paradoxically, curiosity is actually the tool for healing, that we
Mm.
need. Kevin Becker, one of the therapists, he said, curiosity is a barometer for healing in my clients. So when I see them start to become curious again, that's when I know that the clinical work is working, that, they are beginning to heal. And I see that for my own life. I had, auditory hallucinations that were really disturbing and confronting back in 2017. And I still have them occasionally, but not nearly as daily and frequent as they once were. And, although now I see them as like a teacher and as something that's a part of me, I at first was very alarmed and distressed by them. And my therapist at the time told me, to get curious about my voices, which I thought, like, why would I do that? These are the things I
Mm.
fear the most. Like, why would I turn towards the thing that I fear the most?
Yeah, I
My
want to shut those things off. I
Yeah,
don't
I want
want
to
to
shut
listen to
those
them.
things off. Exactly. And so hearing those voices actually allowed me to realize, wow, they came from someplace. They originated from someplace. In my case, they came from my younger years, what I had heard from others or what I told myself growing up, especially when I was grappling with my sexuality or grappling with, the trauma that I was going through as a young person. And that liberated me from those voices and actually taught me a lot about myself and gave me so much healing that I never could have accessed without being curious. And so I think these are two examples, fear and trauma. And there's other things like our time and our lack of proximity from each other that make us less curious or do not create the conditions for us to be curious. But again, paradoxically, like that is what will heal any of these experiences that we're going through, whether it's the fear that we're feeling or the trauma that we've experienced. So yeah, I think that's like kind of a beautiful part of curiosity as well.
So a lesson for educators is to be thinking about trauma and how it happens in school. And I think that's a word that is a little bit ambiguous. We think of, deep pain, but it can happen. The word microaggressions are used. And I think about kids who are curious in class and they throw out an idea or they share an unpopular political view and they get laughed at or teased. And the teacher doesn't see that as an opportunity to help students realize that can have trauma, which is in some cases what the intent of the laughing is you want to put those kids down, or the cyberbullying that goes on, and all this evidence now about the effect of particularly on young women who become victimized by the trauma and the teasing and the canceling and all the stuff that goes on that can shut down curiosity. So I think trying to lessen trauma or to deal with trauma, to be curious about why is it that we sometimes find ourselves hurting other people? What do we do when it happens? Another thing you raise in your book is distance. That was another sort of what you call a speed bump, something that leads to incuriosity. And I think what that made me think about was the distance that people in schools and segregated schools, and they're often our schools are segregated by class and race, even if the schools seem on the outside to be integrated. The way people separate and in their silos, there's a lot of distance between people. And if there's a lot of distance, you become less curious. You just make up your stories among your group about those people. And there's an episode I did with a guy named Jason Morgan. He's a teacher in Compton, and he started something called an empathy network, where he got kids from different schools in the LA area to come together to take hikes in the morning, and their parents sometimes, but from very different backgrounds, just to get to know each other, to reduce the distance. And and without, just very informal, they'd go on hikes and people got curious about each other. They spent time in each other's, they continue to do this time in each other's schools and communities and homes. And reducing that distance provided an opportunity to be curious.
Yeah, I think that's great. And those kinds of any opportunities that get students to, talk to one another and learn about each other's stories, because even in a single classroom, there is such a breadth of different experiences that all those students are going through. So how do you, create moments where they're in conversation, maybe with other students that they're not likely in conversation with, asking questions? How do we, teach compassionate listening skills to students so that they can really hear the stories that people are saying, and see the students that they're going through school with. I think with the trauma piece, it's how do we invest in mental health and make sure that we have the proper infrastructure to support students when they're going through experiences within the school or outside of the school, so that they can be cared for, so that they can be in this place of learning and connection and all the things that we want to give to students. It means that we're not taking away those important resources from them, but actually investing in them. And then, to the point of fear, it's, how do we cultivate courage? And a big way to do that is for teachers to model that courage themselves, to say, hey, I actually got that wrong when I was teaching in the lesson plan. I got that wrong. And sometimes we make mistakes. And so here's the correct way to do it. I call that becoming an admitter. This idea of saying when we are wrong, or saying when we don't know something, which can be fearful for even teachers that I've spoken with. They want to, some of the teachers I've talked to, they want to appear that they are knowledgeable and, create that aura and that, around themselves. I also hear this from leaders in workplaces outside of education. But what the research actually shows us is the more curiosity you have, the more intellectual humility we have, the more we're respected, the more that folks see us as competent, the better collaborators we are, and the more liked we are, in our workplaces. And so that all increases the engagement that people have with us. And if we want to be better teachers, actually, we want to, be more curious. And I've definitely seen that I teach at the university level, but I've definitely seen that in my own work. That I remember being a younger, faculty member and wanting to try to show all the things that I knew, and, all the research I knew, and recognizing, wow, my students were getting as weren't getting as much from my classes compared to when I was curious with them. And I was like, oh my gosh, I actually didn't know that. Like, let's explore that together. Like what can we, here are the boundaries of my knowledge. Like, what are the boundaries of yours? And it just creates a much more genuine learning environment for everyone involved.
Yeah, it's a funny paradox that teachers often, it's easy to sort of believe, well, if I'm a teacher, by definition, I'm supposed to know things about my subjects. And there's truth to that. Of course, you have to be someone that's knowledgeable. But what I have found, and I've done about 100 episodes of teacher stories of just finding out from people who was a teacher that made a difference in your life and what were they like. And invariably, these are people that are curious themselves. They're curious about their students. They're curious about how people learn. They're curious about what it means to be a good teacher. They're curious about the subjects that they teach, even if they've been teaching them for 30, 40 years, they're still curious. And that, goes back to this idea that at the beginning that you talk about in your book. It's contagious. It's the intellectual humility, which seems almost contradiction, is actually a feature of good teaching. Is when people say, I don't know that. And that's really cool. I want to know more. And rather than making students feel like, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you know that? It's like, how cool is that you're still thinking about that? And it's sort of liberating on my part. It says, now that's something maybe I can do too. And
Absolutely. There is this, and it's interesting because when you're talking about those who have, a lot of experience, or what I'm hearing is, those with a lot of experience, I find tend to be more curious. And what we've seen from the research, there's like a meta-analysis that of the research that everyone thinks that curiosity is only for young people, just only for the kids. Like, it's something you're born with, it's something we see in babies. That's all curiosity is for. But actually, that's so untrue. And just because people have written about it on like blogs doesn't make it true. Like what the research actually shows is that curiosity grows over time, that we become more competent in it and we express it more as we grow older. So the most curious people in society aren't babies, although we are seeing them, like be really curious, or even children who are asking us 100 questions in a row. The most curious people in society are the seniors in the world, the elders. We grow with more and more curiosity as we age. And so I found actually that, I have my council of curious elders, and I found that some of the most curious people in my life are older adults, are folks that have a lot of experience behind them. And I think that has been so fascinating and important for me to share because, yes, our curiosity expression changes. We're not asking 100 questions in a row relentlessly like we once did maybe as a child, but that does not mean that we aren't curious about the world, about consciousness, about, ourselves and our emotions and our history and all the things that we are curious about as we grow older. And so, I have this section in my book of like folks in their, 70s and 80s, who continue to express curiosity by sailing around the world or by getting their bachelor degree for the first time. But also, I think it's so important for us to nurture that side of society too. And that's a lot of why I not only do, curiosity culture work in schools, but I also do it in senior living communities. And I think we need to, have this happening all over society. And then I think what happens is it's been so beautiful to see what I call senior seekers get curious and say, I want to go beyond the walls of my independent living community and actually meet people in my community, meet other young people and understand like why are they voting the way they're voting, or understand why they're doing what they're doing and what it feels like to be a young person today in society. And then they in turn get to learn about my experience as someone who has seen a lot in life. And so I'm like, wow, the intergenerational possibilities of us being curious towards one another gets me really, really excited. So I just wanted to share that it is a myth that we're only curious when we are young. So I want everyone to know that. It's so important to know that curiosity is something that's always with us.
and yet, I'm sure you've had this experience. So you'll run into someone that you don't know, and you get really curious because of something that they do or have done, or just something going on in the world, and you'll enter into a conversation and find occasionally you run into a contemporary or an older person who's not curious, who's
Mm.
just stopped, who has stopped being curious. And what I get curious about is when did that happen? And
Yeah. What's the
did school, was there trauma? Was there distance? Was there some of these speed bumps along the way? But people just look at me like, why would you ask that?
Yeah.
I don't want to go there. And it sometimes feels like a challenge to me. Like I want to see if I can, and over time, sometimes it can happen, but, but things do happen in life that cause people to become
Yeah.
incurious.
And a lot of people just don't have the tools. They don't know the practices to become curious. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's why most of it is just practical exercises from the research that you can do to, beef up this curiosity muscle. So I think as long as people have the tools, it becomes a lot more accessible.
Near the end of the book, you talk about what can we do to promote this idea of curiosity. And one thing you say is we should articulate curiosity as an important value and bring it into the spaces you are already in. And I think as educators listening to this, have we brought curiosity into our space and made it articulated as a value that we celebrate and promote. If you look at mission statements from many schools, many of them talk about high expectations, academic excellence. I found one recently. I just went to see if I could find a mission statement that was different than that, and I found one from a school that said, "Our school community cultivates bravery, curiosity, empathy, and joy." And I thought they were naming it and saying, for whatever value mission statements have, the idea is that it's something that we go back to. It's a touchstone that we convey to parents and teachers and students. This is what we're about. So that if people say, there's not much empathy here, there's not much curiosity, someone ought to be able to say, "You're right. That's our mission. How did we lose our way here?" And so that's something that schools or people listening might want to do is, can we name curiosity among other things like empathy and joy as part of our mission as educators?
Yeah, I think that's a great start, but just like putting live, love, laugh on your wall doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you're going to start living and loving and laughing. You have to actually practice it, in your daily life. It's not enough to just see put it in a mission statement or in a strategic plan. And so, what I'd look to for school is to really understand like how curious as a school is exactly what your past guest said. Is there opportunities for students here to meet one another, understand each other's stories, and share their own in a meaningful way? I see programs like Beyond Differences that has no kid eats lunch alone, like programs like that. Are there programs that are building belonging here on campus where people can feel less lonely, less alone, feel like they're connected to the people around them? In classrooms, are we prioritizing questions, not just answers? So if you're doing quizzes and tests to test people's answers, are you also exploring open questions? What kinds of assignments are you giving students? Are you asking them what social issues they really care about, and then asking them to argue the other side and get curious about what other perspectives might be, right? I think like looking for those tangible ways that students or teachers or even parents who are a big part of a school ecosystem, how are they meeting one another, learning about each other? Are there moments for them to engage as parents, to share different techniques or tools that they can use with their children, learn from one another? I mean, those are all things that I look for in schools rather than just seeing it in their mission statement or their strategic plan. But I think it is important to name it. Like if this is important to us, which I think it should be for everyone, we should definitely write it down somewhere and make it known. But then it's okay, what are the actual practices that we're going to bring onto campus?
Yeah. I would think educators, good education leaders, or teachers, others could call the mission statement out 4 times a year and say, "Are we doing this?"
Yeah. Love
Uh,
that.
and
Love
and
that.
and and say, who's got an example of of something that they're doing in their classroom is promoting bravery,
Love it.
curiosity, empathy, as a reminder that these aren't just catchwords that we felt good about one day, but we're actually doing it and we're celebrating the ways that we're doing and learning to do it better all the time.
I love that. I love that because you're operationalizing the
Yeah.
mission statement in that case. And then you're also creating a culture of curiosity where educators can learn from one another. Like, oh, wow, that really created empathy in your students' lives. Oh, wow, that brought joy to, your department. Like that's so great. Like I can learn from that, right? So that is a great example of creating a culture of curiosity, living up to your mission statement, and you'll probably see better results. Um,
Yeah.
by creating that active reflection process, into the process of learning and teaching and training. So that's great.
You alluded to an organization that promotes something, which I just love this idea. I'd never heard of it, but it's No One Eats Alone.
Yeah, yeah.
Just say a bit about that, and there's something that people listening to this might want to adopt something like this in their schools.
Yeah, the Beyond Differences is the nonprofit that runs this, and I really recognize or resonate with it because I think I often ate lunch alone, and I was always, I was bullied a lot when I was younger for being kind of this loner kid. I hadn't really come into myself. I wasn't really comfortable with myself, but really, what all I needed and what I found in high school was I just needed someone to come up to me and like, be curious about me. That then gave me the confidence to share a little bit more about myself and ask them questions too. But that didn't really happen, unfortunately, in middle school. But it did happen in high school. And so people starting to reach out to me, be curious about me because I was at this new school and they were probably, trying to make friends too. It just allowed me to feel seen and empowered. And, I had a really great, high school experience and it was very social and I felt very like I belonged, for the, one of the first times in my like school experience growing up. So I love these efforts and there's so many others. This is one example, but there's so many efforts like this, some that are by national nonprofits that are doing this at schools all across the country, some that are just done by schools themselves, some that are just like a teacher that really cares, and is doing something in their own classroom. And I think they're all necessary, they're all needed. But it really does make a huge impact in the lives of these students, of these young people. I mean, I am a byproduct of that. I am so grateful that those kinds of programs existed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Scott, I think we've come to the end of our time. I really want to thank you for being part of courageous conversations about our schools.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited about this, and I hope if you have any questions, for listeners, and you want to figure out how to bring more curiosity, into your school. Yeah, obviously read, seek, but please reach out. I love working in schools and love supporting teachers, and I'll always respond to an email. I'm like one of those authors. My therapist is like, you need to have more boundaries, but I'm like. But I'm one of those authors that's like, no, I like want to like talk to everyone and try to understand like what's going out there in the world. That's like, I guess my curious self. But please reach out to me. Maybe we can put like the contact info on how to do that in the show notes. But yeah, thanks so much for this conversation. And I'm so excited that we're hopefully encouraging more curiosity.
Yeah, I know we are, and what better place to do it than our schools? And I will include in our episode notes a link to your website and to the book and so forth. For those listening out there, you can find this episode at schoolconversations.org and wherever you get your podcast. So again, thanks so much, Scott, and we'll all do our best to be more curious.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate you all. Thanks for listening.
So long, everyone.